Welcome back to Scaling Theory. My guest today is Glen Weyl, an economist and social technologist known for his interdisciplinary work at the intersection of economics, computer science, sociology, and political science. Glen is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, a co-author of the books Radical Markets and the recently published Plurality, the Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy that he co-authored with Audrey Tang. Glen co-founded the RadicalxChange Foundation, the Plural Technology Collaboratory, and the Plurality Institute. He taught economics at the University of Chicago, Princeton, and Yale. Glen's work frequently explores the potential of technology and market mechanisms to drive social change and address systemic inequalities. In his new book, Glen laid the foundation for a new societal vision, plurality. Our conversation is structured into three distinct parts. We begin by situating the concept of plurality in today's philosophical and technological landscape. We then discuss the technologies that will enable plurality to materialize, and finally, we conclude with a discussion on the challenges ahead. By the end of this discussion, you will know what plurality is, how different it is from the vision of today's tech CEOs, the role of open source AI and blockchain to scale plurality, but also the role legal rules and standards are playing, which of the scaling theory concepts, including fractals, fragility, robustness, chaos, etc., helped Glen and Audrey to define their strategy to take over other visions, and more. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So let me start right away with part one of the conversation on how to situate plurality. And let us begin with a concept, actually. You break down plurality in three interrelated ways. The first is descriptive, and here I quote you in the book: "The social world is neither an unorganized collection of isolated individuals nor a monolithic wall," end of quote. And instead you explain that the social world is a network of individuals who shape our identities and organization. The second way you define plurality is normative. I quote you again: "Diversity is the fuel of social progress," end of quote. And the third is prescriptive. Here I quote you again: "Digital technology should aspire to build the engines that harness and avoid conflagration of diversity," end of quote. Now, this vision of what is plurality is based on past research. I shall mention that you reference to a lot of academic work in the footnotes, which as an academic I appreciated a lot. You talk about philosophies, past experiments. You give a lot of historical examples, which makes the book very reliable. You and Audrey Tang have put all of that together in a very nice way. We will talk about the main elements, but for now, let's jump right to the conclusion. If everything works out the way you want, what kind of world we will live in? And I guess maybe one way for you to answer would be to give me a typical day for a 30-something years old, such as myself, living in a pluralistic world, from waking up to going to bed.
That's an ambitious thing to, ask. It requires really to be a science fiction writer, but I'll do my best to sketch something out. The only thing I'd say is I'm not sure you're typical, Thibaut. You live in, you're a wealthy, highly educated person living in, Western Europe and so forth. So I don't know that anyone's typical, but, happy to see it from that perspective, because I would guess it's somewhat typical among your audience members, at least. So I imagine a future where really things are transformed at every level of technology, every level of how we live. So the things I want to sort of highlight will touch on all of those things. I think we will have tools that make our intimate connections with our children and our partners much deeper. I think we'll have the ability, using brain-to-brain interfaces, to directly share, for example, the experience of your wife's back pain, so that you can think about the ways that you interact with her to make it easier for her because you'll know what it is. I think that you will have remote meetings at your work that are going to be like rich in-person seminars, where you're sitting around the table and you feel the full dynamics, multi-sensory dynamics of the experience, rather than just on a screen. I think that you will have collaborations that will go much deeper in doing your academic work than the ones that you currently have. Not just writing on paper together, but really blending the voices so that you could co-author something in a common voice that blends together the different aspects of your experiences. And you might produce podcasts that are interactive, bringing in not just, me, who's live now, but maybe simulations of historical figures that we might like to have a conversation with, or representations of a company, not its CEO, but of the discourse that's coming out of that company, so that we could actually interrogate them about how they would react to different policies and how they would think about those things. I think that we will have participation in our democratic institutions that will be very real time, very rich. Every time you go down the street and you notice something that seems wrong or that could be done better, you'll make a voice note of it. It will be incorporated into some model that will then exercise your much more flexible rights to vote in a much more real-time way to push towards addressing that shared problem. And you won't use money very much anymore. Instead, you will use social relationships and trust, so that the way that you access the services that you need will be dependent, through these digital means, on your relationships and not just on money. And rather than the big models in the cloud existing in concentrated data centers, they'll exist in personal computers distributed around the world, networked together, so that we're all sharing each other's computational resources. And we will have incredible models, but we will think of them as being derived from the people whose data they came from. And people will find a lot of the work that they do adding additional diversity, provoking new directions for those models in their most creative direction. So the most creative things that people do will not just be what's left, but instead what's encouraged to feed in to make the models better and stronger. So that gives you a sense of the range of different ways in which I imagine the future being different.
So one thing you've mentioned is the ability to bring historical figure to the discussion. If you could bring one person to this discussion, who would that be?
Probably Hannah Arendt. She or J.C.R. Licklider are the two figures I would probably bring in. Both mid-century figures. They were alive at the same time. I don't think they knew each other exactly, but yeah.
So two figures to see also how they will connect.
Yeah.
So, I want to say, and you do say that from the get-go in the book, that you are not embracing all technologies regardless of what they create and the impact on society. So you are not a tech solutionist, or at least not in a sense that every tech is in and of itself good and will solve all the problems. And in fact, you oppose your vision to two other visions that you say dominate today's discourse, and you are not too pleased about that. The first is the technocratic vision embodied by Sam Altman from OpenAI and Reid Hoffman, which seeks to implement a unified, scientific, artificially intelligent planning system. And the second one is the libertarian vision with Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, according to which the sovereignty of each atomistic individual is the central aspiration. Now, do you hope that plurality will grow to the point that it will become the dominant vision, or do you want it to coexist alongside these two other visions, and why not third, fourth, sixth visions that will emerge in the future, because that will be in fact more pluralistic?
So first of all, I think one good analogy for this is the relationship between fascism, communism, and democracy in the 20th century. I think in some sense, to a large extent, kind of democracy ended up winning, and that was probably for the better. And yet, when it got confident, when it got cocky, when it was the dominant thing, it got stale and it started to destroy itself, and it needed other things to challenge it. And so my hope is that, yes, plurality will mostly sort of, quote, win out over these other two visions. And yet, in the process of doing so, if it succeeds, it will seed many more things coming out of it than it destroys. So it will overcome these other two. And yet, at the same time, that will just open the door to an enormous branching of different visions, whether they be ecological, religious, etc. It will make space for much more than it displaces.
Mm. And are you connected in any way to the people I just mentioned, Sam Altman, Peter Thiel? And if so, how do they react to the concept and the vision of plurality? And if you are not connected to them, how do you think they will react when they hear about it, if not already?
So I've had brief interactions with about half of those people. None since these ideas were that developed. So I don't know for sure how they will react. I would love to have a three-way debate aligned according to the way we described this thing, and consider this an open invitation. I suspect that the reaction of Peter and Balaji and Mark would kind of be generally to try to portray plurality as like some lefty woke thing. I think that will be a little bit challenging for them, given that we have endorsements from more prominent right-wing people than actually have endorsed them or supported them. But, I think that's something they might try. And I am not sure what Sam and Reed's reactions are. My guess is that their inclination would be to say something like, yeah, but AI will be more important than everything, so it doesn't matter. Or to say that, these people have never really scaled anything the way that we're scaling things, so they don't really know, or something like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And again, I mean, what I appreciate a lot in the book is that when you explain how plurality may unfold, you actually also expose some of the limits. And I think it is, it makes the point even stronger, actually. And on that, let me introduce what I guess could be a third vision, or maybe not really, but at least another way of looking at society, which is me being French here, looking at universalism. And my question is, how would you situate plurality in relation to universalism, according to which some values or rights are universally binding and recognized, regardless of cultural, geographical, or individual differences? And I'm asking because it seems to me that the division of people into groups is an American approach explained by historical reasons, whereas in France, for example, we see all individuals as being part of only one group, which is the French Republic. So is plurality compatible with universalism?
So there's a lot of things to respect about universalism, and there's a lot of elements that clearly influence the work we do. Clearly, the notion of rights as like a fundamental feature and universal access to those rights is critical to allow pluralism to exist. That being said, the basic imaginary, the basic French, universalist conception is like the typification of the kind of simplistic notion of the liberal state that we think that technology empowers us to move beyond. I think that when you have very limited information technology, when you cannot track complexity, when the only way to divide things into groups is to have some rigid historical division that's like once and for all, like they have in a former French colony of Lebanon, right, among the different religions, then the case against that kind of thing is pretty strong, because you can entrench existing divisions and fix them in time. But if you have the ability to truly dynamically track people's evolutions, to allow groups to come into and out of existence. I think that the flat notion of the individuals and then the whole is just way less expressive and powerful than is a vision that is attentive to social reality and social dynamics. And by the way, the whole French universalist thing is not necessarily working out perfect for the French universalists. Like, I hear that there's a lady that might become president of your country that has a bit of a different perspective on all of this. And I think until we find a way to retain the values that, the core insights of the values that come out of universalism without forcing down everyone's throat something that is not necessarily consistent with how they understand who they are, I think we're going to struggle to confront the challenges of the 21st century.
So let's actually move on to part 2 of the discussion, looking at plurality technologies. You mentioned already using technology to go beyond some of, the simplistic view we can have of societies. And in the beginning of the book, you also mentioned that AI and blockchain are 2 trending technologies. I think no one would argue with that. And later you mentioned the need to combine technologies. It seems to me that these 2, AI and blockchain, are actually nice complements, especially if AI is to scale to the point of being everywhere. I could see how AI can be used to generate an infinite number of outputs, while blockchain can actually certify them. So what do you make of their synergies?
So a couple things to say. First of all, there is a particular set of actual technologies like LLMs or, transformer models that goes under the heading of AI. Yeah. And then there's some actual technologies that are associated with, the blockchain movement, like literal blockchains or zero knowledge proofs, etc. Both of these have really interesting uses, and let's talk about them in a minute. But first, the thing I want to say is there's also something that I do not think is a technology at all. It's purely an ideology, which is the vision of blockchain is trust. We're going to have trustless, machines are going to administer everything. There's going to be no governments or whatever. And then there's going to be an AGI, whatever that is. And this is going to solve all the world's problems. And the problem is when you use terms like AI and blockchain, it's very hard to know whether you're actually talking about technologies, like concrete things that do things, or whether you're talking about the ideological wrapper that people put around them. So I want to actually focus on distributed ledgers. And if we're going to talk about technologies and how they may be useful, distributed ledgers and large transformer models. And those I think are very interesting and useful things, but I think the ideological, gauze around them has limited our ability to actually use them in useful ways. So, and I think they absolutely can be combined and are naturally combined, but only if we can get past that hiccup. So how could they be combined? Well, I think that, as you said, there's a lot of really powerful synergies between these things, even in the ways in which they're kind of imperfect or harmful. So as you said, large models can produce a lot of potentially deceptive, realistic content, which sounds like a bug, but maybe it's actually a feature. Why? Because actually one real problem of our world at present is the way that it's eroded privacy. It's eroded, information can travel outside of context and yet be understood. But if stuff starts becoming non-credible, if anything can be faked, then actually that restores privacy, because everyone will assume that something that was reshared was fake unless they have a certificate showing that it was real. And that allows the cryptography in blockchains to become more relevant, but only if it's cryptography that is much more socially grounded than at present. So I'm in the book we talk about, and I'm a big fan of this notion of a designated verifier proof. This is piece of this information where you can prove it to someone, but only to the person who holds the key associated with the proof. And so then you can make it impossible for people to reshare or overshare information. And so then you can actually harness the fact that blockchains, that AI models are producing so much potentially deceptive content to reground us in our sociality that too often people use blockchain to say that they're going to get rid of. So you see, I think we can use these technologies very powerfully, but only if we have like a clear social vision of why we're using them and for what purposes. Otherwise, they can lead us completely astray. You see what I mean?
Yeah, and it's not going to be easy. A lot of what we see, especially in blockchain, are those huge claims indeed that we don't, it's the end of companies. We've heard that so many times. Companies won't exist in 5 years because everything will be just a DAO. And or on the other end of the spectrum, I guess you have people pushing for blockchain adoption, simply mentioning some technical features, which maybe is sexy or convincing to you and I, but certainly not to my dad, right? So finding to be somewhere in between won't be easy. Now, where I do see that the ideology behind those technologies is playing a role is when it comes to open source, LLMs and foundation models, and public permissionless blockchains or distributed ledgers, as they tend towards decentralization, and which I would argue can promote plurality. Do you think those two groups share similar values and goals, or do you see them as being slightly different?
Well,
or a lot different?
I mean, so I definitely see there as being some really important differences between them. The blockchain style world is very obsessed with money, and the open source world, which has this weird relationship to it, is kind of almost hair shirt obsessed with having no quantitative representation of value. And I think that that's a divide that we have to overcome. I think, we made this book that was like the most open source book that's ever been created. And, it was built openly. It has no copyrights, not just permissive copyrights. It is in CC0. Like, I absolutely am a believer in that kind of thing. And yet, I find myself quite frustrated with statements by open source extremists and people like the Creative Commons Foundation that totally disregard the need to think about consent in the context of these large models. Because yes, it's true that from my perspective and with my needs, this was the right model. But the notion that you should be determining that for all content creators, not just for wealthy content creators, not just for the powerful, that you because of your ideological belief in that, don't think that there needs to be more nuance in how that's addressed, given the imbalances in power, I think is very narrow. So I think we need to find ways past those binaries to have things that are not so financializable, so scammy as a lot of the Web3 world, that aren't just like, here's an NFT, but that actually build together, compose together the way open source software does, but also that have some degree of tracking value, even if it's not in a direct monetary way, even if it's in a way like we do in the credit for the book, that's just about community participation and recognition. Big reason why open source software never addresses the unsexy user interface issues is because there's no way to even credibly prioritize work like that. Everyone just works on whatever they feel like working on, not on what's needed for the project to succeed. So we have to find ways to get past our entrenched ideological positions on these things and to see the important vision and value of the different modalities, and to do things that are creative without saying that they're everything and that everyone, that they have all the insight, and then to build off of each other's insights and move forward and innovate more.
Yeah, so you've mentioned avoiding binary thinking. In a past episode of the podcast with Thomas Wolfe from Hugging Face, we discussed companies that may, because it makes sense at some point, put out a foundation model with a more or less open source license. It doesn't mean that the company won't ever be able to, and maybe for good reason, to one day shift towards something which is a bit more proprietary. So you don't want to impose open source at all costs on all companies, regardless of the need of the day. Now, moving on to technology still, but something more applied. Let's talk about decentralized social media. You mentioned Mastodon, Blue Sky, and the Fediverse several times throughout the book. Now, I guess a fair question is, why have they not scaled, at least yet?
Well, I mean, look, the amount of money that has been invested in those things compared to the amount of money that's been invested in closed social media is like, it's ridiculous. I mean, if we had a nickel for every time that someone, complained about Twitter, or now X, you would have 10 to 100 times the amount of funding that's in total gone into Mastodon. It is a disgrace, in my view, that the way that our discourse around tech proceeds is that there's quite a bit of money for people complaining, but people like Christine Lemmer-Weber, who actually built the ActivityPub standard, like, find it hard to get just basic support for their lives, because we have very limited model for supporting not academic research that is impractical and pie in the sky and blah, blah, blah gets support. But people are actually building the infrastructure that in an open and public way, so much of our lives depend on, get no support. This is a huge problem. And so I think that that's not the only reason why these haven't scaled. There are technical problems, but many of those technical problems might be addressed if we had investment in supporting alternatives.
Yeah. So it seems to me there is that. So on the developer side, and then something we may want to discuss is the incentive for users to actually shift from one tech or one service to the other. Taking a step back in this direction, you point out that the technologies that have scaled so far, search engine, social media, makes us homogeneous. And you argue that a different way forward is possible through scaling technologies that make room for greater diversity. You give a lot of examples, talking about approval voting, where people vote for as many candidates as they want, with the one with the most votes will win, leaving room for more third-party candidates. You talk about immersive shared reality that you say can lead to plurality. And indeed, the book is full of examples like augmented deliberation and social markets. Now, there is this quote from Charlie Munger: "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." Now, given that most people seem to enjoy today's technology, or at least the efficiency of it, are the incentives to move to plural technologies strong enough to lead indeed to a different society?
So I appreciate the value of incentives. As you know, like you, I was trained in economics, but I think that's too narrow of a perspective. Like, for example, a lot of people want to say, oh, social media has these incentives because of the advertising, but they treat the business model as fixed. And in fact, not only is the business model not fixed, it's not even the same for other companies in the same industry. So I work at Microsoft. We do not sell to end consumers. We do not sell to advertisers. Those are not our customers for the most part. Bing is an exception, but our customers are usually businesses. And do businesses care about engagement? Do they care about attention? No, they want people to be productive. Now, that creates issues as well, because often the business purchasers don't know what the rest of the people want and what people actually enjoy. So there are issues there too, but there's not just one model here, right? You can absolutely, if you can show that a software system creates clear, tangible productivity benefits, sell the productivity benefit that it gives without worrying about whether people find it engaging. You can, and you can make people migrate because that's the software that their company provides. And similarly, it's not true that social media just display what people enjoy and find entertaining most. Otherwise, there would be no advertising. People don't like advertising generally. So social media displays a balance of stuff that is not that desired by people and stuff that is more desired. Now, the question is whether rather than just selling them commercial products, we could have it instead be funded by businesses, by churches, by local governments, by people that have an interest in different groups working together more effectively. And I think that there's tons of money there, probably more money than there is from advertisers, but it's a lack of creativity in designing that business model and describing it. It's not that the incentives point in one direction only. The incentive view, I think, is very misleading because it assumes that people have perfect information and that they can imagine all possible futures. But, I would say contra Munger, show me the imagination and I'll tell you the outcome. Because the imagination of what the incentive is prior to the incentive itself.
So that makes a perfect transition to part 3 of the discussion, looking at the challenges. So lack of imagination, or maybe imagination being not scaled or shared equally among society, may be one. It seems to me, and being a lawyer, of course, I have to talk about the rules and standards, that they obviously play an important role in shaping society and democracy. Obviously, there is no rule of law regimes without the law. That's pretty obvious. But the law also regulates technology, can enable technologies or create obstacle, right? So as it stands, the law often imposes a disproportionate compliance burden on open source technology, and I think some technologies that may go in the direction of plurality. I'll just give one example. Article 11 of the AI Act that just came out in Europe. It requires that all companies issuing a AI system broadly defined, that is high risk, also broadly defined, have to put out a technical documentation and to keep it up to date while explaining how their product complies with EU fundamental rights. It seems to me that obviously it is much harder to do if you run an open technology that receives open contributions than if you run a closed source system. So here's my question to you. How can we avoid legal rules and standards being captured by some private interest, which is the worst case scenario, or, which is maybe more realistic and common, the law being non-neutral, maybe not even on purpose? And I'm asking because I'm afraid that if we can't avoid those, plurality will not materialize because it will always be, captured by some industry one way or the other.
Well, so first, let me give you another example that goes in your direction and then challenge the example you gave just a little bit, but both in a way that I think points towards a bit of an answer. So the Open Collective Foundation, I don't know if you're familiar with them, they are an organization that basically allows open source projects to have an international nonprofit presence. They shut down because they were not able to maintain themselves because there is such a discriminatory environment against open source projects, much less not just being any public funding, which we need. These things can't survive and be sustainable without charitable and government financial support. The governments are actually undermining them. They're actually making it harder for them to operate than alternatives. So at the same time, I'm not completely sure about what you said about maintaining that document being harder for an open source project. I agree that the open source project will tend to do things in a different way, but we just wrote a book in, I think, a more effective way, a faster way. The book is not short, as you had the pleasure of discovering, and we wrote it in 2 years, which I think is quite rapid for that kind of a book. And we did it with the help of a global community of people. So I don't think that there's necessarily a reason why you can't open source writing, open source compliance, open source governance, as much as you can open source the writing of the code itself. However, doing so, I do think, requires a certain amount of flexibility. If you just want everything to be like the exact way the EU says it, rather than a broader standard and responsiveness to democratic input and demonstration that you're doing that in some reasonable way, rather than I would love to move to a world where it's less nation state based and more based on, well, is there some plausible open, participation in making the governance of this thing? And if not, well, then let's crack down on it. But if there is, we shouldn't be sure that the European Parliament is the world's be all end all of what it means to have a democratic governance process for a technology, right? Now, I do want them to enforce those standards very strongly against proprietary, for-profit, closed models, because that makes space for those other things. But on the other hand, I hope that there would be some leaning into saying, we actually want to sandbox our own processes. We don't know that the European Parliament is the ultimate way to make decisions. And we want to open space for people to show us how to do it better.
Yeah. I was about to say, indeed, if the only objective you have in mind is to comply with the EU AI Act, then let's say that you do have lawyers and people with legal expertise that will contribute to your compliance. If they come with different background and cultures, it may be harder still than to have, a law firm based in Brussels that goes to dinner with EU policymakers and that will know exactly how to comply. However,
harder but better, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And probably better even for the EU in the long run, because the reality is it's not like everything is going great in terms of the EU and its competition in international technology markets, or its relationship to other jurisdictions like Africa. And so like maybe this can show a better way of inclusion to help the EU move forward, and there would be openness to that. And at the same time, there would also be stringency on the standard for-profit model, and that would help open more space for those alternatives to emerge.
Yeah. And, EU policymakers have been very proud of the Brussels effects, the idea that they regulate first in Europe and then it influences other parts of the world, either because it sends a nice signal to other policymakers or because companies having to be compliant in Europe end up being compliant all over the world. I would argue that the AI Act is the end of the Brussels effect, and I've seen policymakers being very vocal and critical toward the AI Act. So maybe that's a step in the direction of indeed having some more plurality in how we approach the regulation of AI.
Well, I think that one advantage that you have at the moment is that a lot of other jurisdictions have been very sleepy in the past, and I don't think on AI they are as much. You've seen a lot more movement in the UK, in the US, in Taiwan, in India, in the Middle East, certainly in mainland China. So I don't think it's going to be quite so simple as in the past.
The US is a good example.
Yeah.
People look at least from Europe at the federal level where it's quite sleepy, although there is the Biden executive order, but at the state level, I think we passed the 500 legislation being introduced to a vote. Now, this podcast focuses on scaling theory, hence the name, and it seems to me that your book indirectly relies on the concepts. First, because it examines how different technologies have scaled, then it correlates this scaling of different technologies with the different visions of society and how they have also scaled. And it proposes to scale specific technologies to enable plurality.
Well, it even has a section on scaling theory, section 6-0, which is all about a sort of pluralistic theory of scaling. So,
Yes, and so that's the question I wanted to ask, knowing that the answer is in the book once again. But which concepts that are pretty common in the field, such as fractals, which you mentioned in the book, fragility, robustness, chaos, that you also mentioned, which ones have most informed your analysis and strategy for scaling plurality?
So I think the two things that have influenced it most are the idea of that comes out of sociolinguistics and has come into econ a little bit more recently, that you need to really have a range of medium scale, tightly internally connected, loosely externally connected units in which you can incubate different approaches, and then they can, based on their success, diffuse across to adjacent units. That blitz scaling or fragmentation are both very problematic, because fragmentation undermines innovation, even though it seems like it would lead to innovation, but you need scale to get innovation, actually. But also scaling to the whole thing makes the system extremely fragile. It means that, things either succeed or they catastrophically fail. And these sort of intermediate scales of development, incubation, and then spread are extremely important. A second notion that has influenced us a lot is this notion of the edge of chaos, which is related to this. So this is a concept from complexity theory, and it says that many systems, from physical systems, biological systems, social systems, have some parameter that determines sort of the degree of change. And that when this is high, the system is chaotic, and when it's low, the system is static. And that right on the phase transition between those, you get the development of complexity. And that idea has been, I think, very central to ours. It's also related to the notion of the narrow corridor in the work of Acemoglu and Robinson about, sort of the dangers of both authoritarianism and sort of chaos.
Yeah. And on the concept of chaos, one of the past episodes featured Dawn Farmer, who just put out a book on the concept. So have a look at that.
Wonderful.
All right. We are nearing toward the end. But I want to ask the big question that I'm asking actually all of my guests. The purpose of the podcast is to document the power laws that undermine the world in which we live.
Is it?
And it seems to me that given your background as an economist, your previous work on blockchain and AI, your position at Microsoft, your previous book on radical markets, and this book, you are well positioned, to say the least, to talk about the power laws that underline the growth of new technologies. So here's the question. What are the patterns that you have seen over the years? Or I guess to put it differently, what can we learn from the scaling of past technologies that we can use to better address future obstacles?
A lot of people, I think, are rightly skeptical of the notion that we can achieve much greater equality because of the persistence of power laws and income distributions. And I think that that's right, and that they assume that we have to have a single unitary notion of income. And I think that's what we need to move past. I think that any single scale will end up with a power law distribution, but the way that you get actual some notion of balance is to avoid having any linear ranking to begin with. Because if you have enough different separated spheres and each of them has a sufficiently uncorrelated power law itself, then some overall notion of people's participation becomes much more bell curve. And, that to me is the key. The key is not equality. It's actually moving further from equality. Because actually a linear ranking is closer to one-dimensional equality than is many, many, many dimensions, each with its own maybe power law distribution. And so that pluralization, diversification, speciation, that's how we get to a world that I think works for us.
On that, and to end on the practical and forward-looking note, you mentioned 5 areas where a plurality approach could scale: the workplace, health, media, environment, and education. Which will scale first and why?
My guess is media, because I think media is in an absolute crisis moment right now. It's, the social media world is so under-trusted, and the traditional media world is sort of in the process of collapse. So I think it is just desperate for something to step in. I think a lot of these other things have a lot more sort of structure and rigidity to them. But the media world is sort of at a very unsettled moment. So that would be my guess. And we're kind of already seeing that. It's probably the most large-scale pluralistic thing that exists right now is the X community notes system. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think that the confidence in everything else at Twitter just tanks so much that they just need to scale that system and use it much more broadly. So I definitely look with some optimism to the media environment.
Yeah, I was about to ask for practical examples because in each of those 5 areas, you do provide examples of what worked already. The community notes on X is lovely, especially when they go after Elon Musk. I always find that to be quite entertaining.
Yeah.
Is there any other use case in media that comes to mind as being something we should explore?
Well, I'm very excited about the way in which more immersive technologies can create new types of empathetic media experiences. There are immersive shared reality experiences of having you like interact with a computer virus as if it was sort of a real entity and trace it through the way it propagates in networks. There are experiences that put you into environmental situations, into very different social realities. I think that's another very exciting thing that could change our experience in media.
Yeah, and on that again, thanks a lot for putting all of those examples and underlining a new theory for how to think about all of what is coming our way in this book. Thanks a lot for everything you've been doing over the past couple of years. And on that, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you, Thibaut.